Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about the attributes of quadrilaterals and how to sort them based on that using the hierarchy. So remember we talked about quadrilaterals right before we went out on this break. And so let's just kind of review it. You will have your test next week, but don't worry, we're going to go over all of that as it gets closer to the date. So when we talk about quadrilaterals, remember we're talking about polygons that have 4 sides and 4 angles. So all of these shapes have to have those 2 things, 4 sides and 4 angles. Okay, so I'm going to be typing some of the different attributes that we use so you can remember them. So we talked about a couple different types of quadrilaterals in class, and it can be sorted a bunch of different ways. So the first 2 ways you can then classify a quadrilateral is into either a kite or a trapezoid. So remember, a kite kind of looks like this, just like one you would fly, and it's got those 2 adjacent congruent sides, and then you have a trapezoid. And remember, we use the inclusive definition, which means at least one set of parallel sides. So sometimes when you're looking online at other resources, they will use an exclusive definition. We use the inclusive, so it just has to have at least one, but it can have more than one. And the kite has to have those 2 congruent adjacent sides. Adjacent means next, and congruent means the same. And you show that by having the lines like I am doing right now. Okay, so then from there, a trapezoid can then be sorted even more specifically into a parallelogram. So remember, the trapezoid had to have at least one pair of parallel lines, or sides, excuse me. So what do we think the parallelogram has to have? You're right, it has to have 2 pairs of parallel sides, right? So both the top and bottom and the left and right sides are going to be parallel to each other. So that's going to kind of look like this. Okay, so they don't necessarily have to be the same length all the way around. We're going to get there, that gets more specific, but they do need to be parallel to each other. Then from a parallelogram, you can either classify a quadrilateral even further into a rhombus or a rectangle. A rectangle, we use those a lot. They're in this hierarchy. Ooh, that was a bad line. Let me undo that. Okay, so a rectangle, it's got the 4 sides, 4 angles, and its angles are specifically 90-degree angles, which we show using this little box, right? So all 4 angles have to be 90-degree angles, and the opposite sides are congruent. So the top and bottom sides are the same size, and the left and right sides are the same size. And you would show those again using those lines. And because a rectangle is underneath a parallelogram, that means it also has to have those attributes. So not only does it have 4 right angles and 2 sets of congruent sides, it also has 2 sets of parallel sides, right? Because it is also a parallelogram and a trapezoid and a quadrilateral. Okay, so then if it's not a rectangle, then it can be a rhombus. So a rhombus looks very similar to a parallelogram, except you take it one step further and all of its sides are congruent. So they are all the same size, which is how it relates to a kite, because remember that kite has to have the 2 sides that are next to each other be the same. Well, if you look at it, the 2 sides next to each other are the same because all 4 sides are the same. So you still have those 2 pairs of parallel sides, and then you still have those adjacent congruent, and you put them both together and you get that specific rhombus. So then from a rhombus into a rectangle, you can get even more specific into a square, right? And we all know a square, all the sides are the same size, all of the angles are 90-degree angles, the opposite sides are parallel. It has all of those attributes. So you take all of those and you put them into one, and it becomes the square. And because a square is at the bottom of the hierarchy, it is always the things above it. A square is always a rhombus. A square is always a rectangle. A square is always a parallelogram, a trapezoid, a kite, a quadrilateral. However, when you're working back down, a quadrilateral